Mussolini, hailed by his compatriots as the genius of Italy, addresses 500,000 fascists from the Piazza del Duomo in Milan.
Che raccoglie la parte migliore del popolo italiano e ne incendia la civiltà sta passione di grandezza.
Though his speech has caused a certain amount of comment abroad on account of its militaristic viewpoint, Il Duce's creed is accepted with enthusiasm in his own country, where unity of thought and action is the fundamental idea underlying the dictatorship.
We know what democracies are. We know what military dictatorships are. We know what socialist governments want and how they generally operate. The ideology of fascism is a little harder to identify as a coherent phenomenon, and this is largely due to its syncretic nature. A traditional conservative might be forgiven for thinking fascism is or was a militant leftist movement. After all, many of its members had been prominent socialists, for quite a long time in some cases, including Mussolini. Although the fascists didn't advocate a pure socialist platform, they hadn't ideologically embraced free markets either. Neither were they traditionalists regarding the state, nor trying to restore an older form of government, like an absolutist monarchy, or foster some kind of model Catholic society. This syncretic character of fascism has resulted in a somewhat befuddling movement that doesn't neatly fit into any pre-existing box. Historian Paul Gottfried raises the key question in his excellent book, Fascism, the Creator Concept, with the following, quote, "Can you define fascism in any place and at any time in terms of a consistent body of ideas, as opposed to a mere reaction against movements or ideologies that the fascists were resisting?" End quote. The natural place to begin answering this question is to look at what the leading fascists themselves said of their own movement before examining the fascist regime in practice. When trying to understand a political movement, it's always helpful if the organization in question has penned a manifesto for the inquisitive sort to thumb through. Fortunately, there exists a famous co-authored essay between Mussolini and fascist philosopher Giovanni Gentile titled The Doctrine of Fascism, first published in 1932, which outlines the ideology of fascism in detail. From the section, The Fascist Totalitarian Vision of the Future, quote, "The fascist negation of socialism, democracy, liberalism should not, however, be interpreted as implying a desire to drive the world backwards to positions occupied prior to 1789, a year commonly referred to as that which opened the demo-liberal century. History does not travel backwards. The fascist doctrine has not taken de Maistre as its prophet. Monarchical absolutism is of the past, and so is ecclesiology. Dead and done are the feudal privileges and the division of society into close, uncommunicating castes. Neither has a fascist conception of authority anything in common with that of a police-ridden state. A party governing a nation totalitarianly is a new departure in history. There are no points of reference nor of comparison. From beneath the ruins of liberal, socialist, and democratic doctrines, fascism extracts those elements which are still vital. It preserves what may be described as the acquired facts of history. It rejects all else. That is to say, it rejects the idea of a doctrine suited to all times and to all people. Granted that the 19th century was a century of Marxism, liberalism, democracy. This does not mean that the 20th century must also be the century of Marxism, liberalism, and democracy. Political doctrines pass, nations remain. We are free to believe that this is the century of authority, a century tending to the right, a fascist century. If the 19th century was the century of the individual, liberalism implies individualism, we are free to believe that this is the collective century, and therefore the century of the state." End quote. There's a number of things here which set fascism apart from both the left and traditional right. The first point is that fascism is openly syncretic, taking what it claims to be the working, vital elements from various historical systems that came before, while casting aside that which it considers dysfunctional or outdated. There's an emphasis on the nation and a belief that prescriptions of the time come and go are not applicable in all times or places and should be subject to change or discarded, for the cause of better serving the nation if need be. Fascism has an eye to the past, to take what works, but is futurist in that it believes it's forging something for a new age, and is thus anti-conservative. It claims to be of the right, thus hierarchical and non-egalitarian, and places principal authority and direction of the nation in the hands of the state. This is a departure from traditional modes of older authority, where the concept of symphonia was prominent, that is, the harmony between temporal, stately powers and the authority of the church, which co-govern over a dignified humanity created in the image of God. There's also the use of that infamous word, totalitarian. Continuing on, from the section titled, The Absolute Primacy of the State, quote, "The keystone of the fascist doctrine is its conception of the state, of its essence, its functions, and its aims. For fascism, the state is absolute, individuals and groups relative. Individuals and groups are admissible insofar as they come within the state. Instead of directing the game and guiding the material and moral progress of the community, the liberal state restricts its activities to recording results. The fascist state is wide awake and has a will of its own. For this reason, it can be described as ethical. The fascist state is not a night watchman, solicitous only of the personal safety of its citizens, nor is it organized exclusively for the purpose of guaranteeing a certain degree of material prosperity and relatively peaceful conditions of life. A board of directors would do as much. Neither is it exclusively political, divorced from practical realities and holding itself aloof from the multifarious activities of the citizens and the nation. The state, as conceived and realized by fascism, is a spiritual and ethical entity for securing the political, juridical, and economic organization of the nation. An organization which in its origin and growth is a manifestation of the spirit. The state guarantees the internal and external safety of the country, but it also safeguards and transmits the spirit of the people, elaborated down the ages in its language, its customs, its faith. The state is not only the present, it is also the past and above all the future. Transcending the individual's brief spell of life, the state stands for the immanent conscience of the nation. If liberalism spells individualism, fascism spells government. The fascist state is, however, a unique and original creation. It is not reactionary but revolutionary, for it anticipates the solution of certain universal problems which have been raised elsewhere." End quote. There's a lot to unpack here. The fascist does not conceive of the state in a purely Hobbesian manner, although the practicalities of Thomas Hobbes are present. Mussolini doesn't believe that the state was simply erected as a ward against chaos, for the protection of its citizens and to establish order. Nor did the fascists conceive of the state like the Marxists, where it was the product of materialist forces to enforce slave, feudal, capitalist, or socialist economic structures, before one day withering away after full equality had been achieved and all class distinctions erased. Mussolini and Gentile had an almost mystical conception of the state, that it was somehow an emergent phenomenon from the will and spirit of the nation. The fascist ideology also rejects the purely pragmatic, value-free, and secular vision of the state found in liberalism, where the state somehow stands above the competing morals and values of society, acting as a mere referee in the game. In the fascist ideal, the state can claim to be an ethical force because it is responsible for transmuting the nation's values and customs and asserting itself in the world as the embodied will of the nation. The fascist state also wasn't a propositional nation created by Enlightenment liberals as the neoconservatives envisioned America's founding. The fascist conception of the state is a more primordial phenomenon. Yes, the state is organized power, but it is also something more amorphous than that. Fascists believe that the state was an institution particular to the peculiar characteristics of a people and would thus vary from nation to nation. Mussolini and Gentile use religious language around the state, referring to it as the expression of the universal ethical will, that the nation is expressed in the state, and a manifestation of the spirit. It was totalitarian in the sense that the nation and the state were inextricably linked in the fascist ideology, and the goal, however fanciful, was to have the wills and interests of the two align. Mussolini coined the now infamous phrase linked to totalitarian thinking: everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. To quote historian on fascism, Stanley Payne, totalitarianism within the Italian context meant total representation of the nation and total guidance of national goals through the state. This term totalitarian at the time was intended to have a positive connotation, that the commitment and devotion of the citizens to the state would yield benefits for all involved. Certainly in execution at least, the fascist conception of totalitarianism was somewhat different and less extreme than what is thought of in Stalinism or German National Socialism. There are some similarities to both Stalinism and Nazism, however, in that the fascists confessed the supreme authority of the state and that it was leading society into a new future. But the future in fascism is subject to change, as clearly outlined in the doctrines of fascism. Fascism did not have a grand endgame for the future, like in communism or Nazism, although like both, it is distinct from cultural conservatism and traditional forms of statecraft. Another point of difference is that fascism also wasn't interested in totally remodeling the Italian people into something other than they were, like you might find in Stalinist efforts to create a new Soviet man, or Hitlerian obsessions with the Aryan race. From Professor Emeritus Paul Gottfried's Fascism, the Queer of a Concept. Quote, Italian fascism was less modern to Nazism, and not really totalitarian, no matter how hyperbolically Mussolini and Gentile described their cult of the state. End quote. The totalitarian language of the fascist regime was thus more aspirational on the part of its founders than a practical reality. Dr. Gottfried also highlights that people were allowed to leave the country or openly disagree so long as they didn't actively go against or undermine the fascist regime. In short, the fascist state was authoritarian, though not a terror state, nor did it seek to totally remold social life. What is more, the totalitarian phrase, everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state, appears on some level to be an assertion of what the fascists believed the state already was to some degree. Nothing against the state denotes the temporal primacy of the state. It implies a single power holder, either the dictator, junta, or otherwise small group of governing elite explicitly monopolizing political power. However, everything within the state, nothing outside the state, have both a clear-cut and more abstract meaning. Practically speaking, virtually everyone in the world resides within a state, not outside the bounds of a state. That was not true in the past, but as civilization has emerged, states are now ubiquitous. As such, everything within the state is in one sense a modern reality. Again, from the Doctrine of Fascism, section titled The Individual and Liberty, quote, it is impossible to conceive any individual existing outside the state unless he be a savage whose home is in the solitude of the sandy desert, end quote. On the concept of freedom and liberty, Mussolini continues, quote, the concept of freedom is not absolute because nothing is ever absolute in life. Freedom is not a right, it is a duty. It is not a gift, it is a conquest. It is not equality, it is a privilege. The concept of freedom changes with the passing of time. There is freedom in times of peace, which is not the freedom of times of war. There is freedom in times of prosperity, which is not a freedom to be allowed in times of poverty. In our state, the individual is not deprived of freedom. In fact, he has greater liberty than an isolated man, because the state protects him and he is a part of the state. Isolated man is without defense, end quote. This sounds like something you'd hear straight from the mouth of Thomas Hobbes, pointing to the fact that the isolated man is vulnerable and that material conditions and conflict figure into the calculation of true liberty. Mussolini is a lot more blunt also than most modern statesmen, saying in advance that yes, in certain times your liberty will be sacrificed for the supposed greater good, particularly in wartime. He also inextricably links liberty to duty and as a prize to be conquered, not as some base condition of man where he is born free but everywhere in chains. To Mussolini, liberty is the byproduct of order and duty. More on this, Mussolini continues, quote, fascism has restored to the state its sovereign functions by claiming its absolute ethical meaning against the egotism of classes and categories. To the government of the state, which was reduced to a mere instrument of electoral assemblies, it has restored dignity as representing the personality of the state and its power of empire. It has rescued state administration from the weight of factions and party interests, end quote. This last point made by Mussolini is either wishful or shrewd politicking. Public choice theory tells us that even if competing political parties are abolished, institutions and departments themselves have their own and competing interests, if for no other reason than for funding. However, there's an implied advocacy for the merits of explicit, formal power here as opposed to the pre-existing divisions of power under Italy's old parliamentary system. In the chaos that racked Italy prior to 1922, there were competing power factions within the country, vying for control of the state, with socialists on the street and in parliament, alongside unionized workers, exerting their will over society, while the fractious parliament stood unable or unwilling to put down these disturbances. Formal power was not truly held by the state in this instance. Thus, the opportunity for competing groups to abrogate power to themselves arose, and ensuing instances of localized tyranny ensued. In contrast, the fascist regime was uninterested in class struggle or the preservation of parliamentary democracy at the expense of order. In modern Western political systems, the governing elite will de jure maintain and exercise power, but is happy to shift sovereignty and responsibility to others, visible or invisible. Thus it's difficult at times to know where to exert pressure for the purposes of change or who to appeal to for the airing of grievances. One benefit to formalized power is that this ambiguity is largely eliminated, although the risk to the state is that they will directly and inevitably be blamed for real or perceived failures of the system. This need for formalized, explicit power held by the state is also a necessary precondition for another defining aspect of the ideological fascist state, which is corporatism. Corporatism in structure was essentially the union of different groups into larger collectives on the basis of their common interests, as a type of almost modern guild system. On corporatism from the doctrines of fascism, quote, "Fascism is likewise opposed to trade unionism as a class weapon, but when brought within the orbit of the state, fascism recognizes the real needs which gave rise to socialism and trade unionism, giving them due weight in the guild or corporative system, in which divergent interests are coordinated and harmonized in the unity of the state." End quote. The advocacy of corporatism in the fascist ideology necessitated the union of, generally, big businesses and state, where supposedly the interests of the two could somehow be harmonized. This is again distinct from laissez-faire capitalism and socialism, by forging an explicit third position where private capital was retained but put to the service of economic nationalism. One final example of fascist ideology, which actually shifted over time, was its shedding of anti-clericalism and endorsement of the local Catholic religion. Again from the doctrine of fascism, quote, "The state is not indifferent to religious phenomena in general, nor does it maintain an attitude of indifference to Roman Catholicism, the special positive religion of Italians. The state has not got a theology, but it has a moral code. The fascist state sees in religion one of the deepest spiritual manifestations, and for this reason it not only respects religion, but defends and protects it. The fascist state does not attempt, as Robespierre at the height of the revolutionary delirium of the Convention, to set up a god of its own, nor does it vainly seek, as does Bolshevism, to efface God from the soul of man." End quote. This may have been pragmatic politicking on the part of Mussolini, a previous anti-clericalist and apparent non-believer, yet there is an ideological recognition that religion does in fact play an important role for holding society together, and there is a desire to preserve it within the fascist ideology. Perhaps the most significant example of this was the 1929 signing of the Lateran Pact, which bequeathed the Vatican to the papacy, an issue which had existed between Italy and the Roman Pontiff since Italian unification. Furthermore, attempting to stamp out religion and replace it, as did the communists or French revolutionaries, was considered the height of folly, not at all likely to be well taken in Catholic Italy, and would damage society more than aid it, while, not insignificantly, lowering Il Duce's standing in the minds of the Italian people. Having examined the different key aspects of the fascist ideology, the natural question arises: how did this doctrine of fascism play out in practice and affect the lives of normal Italians? Our next video will take us to Italy after the fascists seized power and witness their attempt to employ their vision in the Kingdom of Italy.